All right, thank you everybody. Good morning. I'm really excited to be here, and thanks to the DAR for having me. Thanks for people tuning in virtually. I'm excited to share one piece in the White House collection with you all today that I think has a really interesting history and really gets into these ideas of origins and impacts of everyday objects. But before we dive into the object analysis, I wanted to just share a brief overview of the White House Historical Association and the White House collection for anybody who might be unfamiliar. So the White House Historical Association is also a nonpartisan nonprofit. We're located really just across the street here. If you haven't been, you can come check us out at Historic Decatur House. But we were founded by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy in 1961 for the purpose of really sharing this history of the executive mansion. And our mission has really evolved and diversified in the years since. But part of this is the interpretation of the White House collection. And the White House collection features over 60,000 fine and decorative arts items that are cared for by a very small but dedicated team of curators. And this preservation also began under First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, who spearheaded efforts to hire the very first White House curator. You can see her on screen here accepting an acquisition, Lorraine Waxman Pierce. Mrs. Kennedy also spearheaded the decision to make the White House a museum that is protected by Congress. Any changes to the state floor and the ground floor, those public areas that you would see on a tour, are protected. Any old president can't come in and decide to rip down the Blue Room, for example. And so a lot of these decisions, including creating the White House Historical Association, are a testament to Mrs. Kennedy's vision of maintaining the White House and its fine and decorative arts collection for the public. Now, we at the White House Historical Association help with acquisition and preservation efforts, but the interpretation of pieces as well. And as Sarah said, I'm a public historian by training. The association has really been focused on modernizing our interpretation of visual and material culture to focus more on people's stories rather than on the aesthetic value of these pieces. And that's what I want to share today. So in 2020, we launched our Slavery in the President's Neighborhood Research Initiative. I really encourage you all to check it out later if you haven't seen it before. But this initiative really seeks to share the stories of the enslaved individuals who built, lived, and worked at the White House, as well as the President's Neighborhood where we're sitting right now. But one avenue that I realized had been really understudied as part of our initiative was the connection between material culture and slavery, and items in the White House collection that have a connection to slavery in some way, shape, or form. So the research that I'm going to share with you all today about Martha Washington's sugar bowl is an attempt to really rectify and fill that gap in our research. So here she is, the beautiful piece that we're going to talk about, Martha Washington's sugar bowl. And this has been in the White House collection for over a century. But today we're going to go back hundreds of years to its initial production and then move chronologically through the object's provenance to better understand how this single, unassuming piece of tableware can really tell a multifaceted story about slavery, cuisine, art, and national memory in the United States and beyond. So let's come back to this slide later to talk more about the actual design, but I want to start with the consumer culture that made a piece like this necessary. So now let's start with sugar, slavery, and empire, just a small task. Sugar consumption dates back to ancient times, but for thousands of years, sugar was really limited to only the most affluent of consumers. But the prospect of profit from sugar and other cash crops was one of the most major motivations for the colonization of the Atlantic world from the 15th to the 18th centuries. And this is following the successful refinement of sugar on the Atlantic island of Madeira, which had been colonized by the Portuguese in the 15th century. The warm tropical climate of the Caribbean we know now provides ideal growing conditions for sugar cane, and it promised a lucrative return on investment for any of these colonizers. So by the 17th century, we see the French, Dutch, Portuguese, English, Spanish, so on, colonizing areas in the Americas, displacing indigenous groups from the land in order to create plantations for sugar as well as other crops. Now, we know that Europeans originally attempted to employ indigenous groups in these plantations, as well as free and indentured laborers, but soon turned to enslaved Africans as a group that they thought to be a bountiful and expendable workforce. These plantations were in places like Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, Cuba, and Barbados, and these were run off of the backs of enslaved laborers who were forcibly removed from the coast of Africa and taken to the Caribbean via the transatlantic slave trade. It's really important to note here that sugar plantations were extremely dangerous. We know them as some of the most dangerous conditions for enslaved people in world history. They labored year-round, working in the fields during the planting and harvesting seasons, but later in mills, boiling houses, and distilleries to create refined sugar, but also sugar byproducts like rum and molasses that were very popular in the colonies that would become the United States. We know that these boiling houses and distilleries had conditions that led to maiming, death, just unimaginable injuries. And so this depiction that you can see here from Brown University is them cutting the sugar cane. And then I also have an interesting advertisement on the screen here, and I apologize that it's a bit small for those of you in the back, but it's from a local newspaper, the Alexandria Gazette in 1802, and it shows these products that are coming from the Caribbean, like sugar, molasses, and other slave-made products for sale in the DC area. Now, because of this atmosphere of increased sugar production, it becomes more affordable and widespread across the world and in what would become the United States. And if you have a lot of sugar, you come to need a sugar bowl on your table. So this is part of this trend that connects consumers and everyday Americans to the transatlantic slave trade. And I want to emphasize here that the connection between slavery and sugar is very well known by colonists. George Washington, for example, and we're going to come back to George many times throughout this presentation, was keenly aware of sugar plantations, but also of the harsh conditions that happened there. He visited the Caribbean as a young man, first in 1751, traveling with his brother Lawrence, who you can see here, to the sugar-rich island of Barbados because Lawrence had tuberculosis. And they thought that going to the Caribbean would provide this restorative atmosphere to help him with his illness. This did not help, unfortunately, but Washington is observing the sugar plantations there. And we have a letter where he writes that he was perfectly enraptured with the beautiful prospects of the fields of cane. But we also know that as an adult, George Washington chose to sell enslaved laborers from his Mount Vernon plantation to the Caribbean as punishment because of the conditions there. In 1793, he threatened to sell a 15-year-old boy named Ben to the islands, and he writes, "I will ship him off, as I did Wagoner Jack, another enslaved man, to the West Indies, where he will have no opportunity of playing such pranks as he is at present engaged in." Meanwhile, abolitionists emphasized the way that the consumption of products made by enslaved labor were helping the continuation of the institution. At the end of the 18th century, we see anti-slavery Americans begin to consider alternatives to sugar cane. In 1789, abolitionists from Philadelphia, Dr. Benjamin Rush, and other Pennsylvania Quakers created the Society for Promoting the Manufacture of Sugar from the Sugar Maple Tree. And one of those supporters of sugar maple was Thomas Jefferson, certainly not somebody that we would characterize as an abolitionist, but he attempted to create a maple sugar grove at his plantation Monticello in Virginia. And even though he was himself a slave owner, he had these ideas of hoping to end slavery in the Caribbean. As president, he formally abolished the importation of slaves to the United States, and he hoped to find a way to gradually end slavery in the United States, although his ideas of gradual emancipation and colonization are extremely problematic. So this quote I think is so interesting. He says, "The maple tree yields a sugar equal to the best from the cane, yields it in great quantity, and with no other labor than what the women and girls can bestow. What a blessing to substitute a sugar which requires only the labor of children for that which it is said renders the slavery of the blacks necessary." So he's directly making this connection once again between slavery and sugar. And of course, I want to emphasize as an important note here that Jefferson owned more than 600 enslaved people during his lifetime, the most of any US president. And every day he directly contradicted his own claim that all men are created equal. But even Jefferson saw difficulties of the continuation of the importation of enslaved people and the use of enslaved labor in these products. And abolitionists continue to connect sugar consumption to slavery throughout the 19th century. I love this children's alphabet that's made by Pennsylvania Quaker Hannah Townsend for the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. This is from 1846, and it says, S is the sugar that the slave is toiling hard to make, to put into your pie and tea, your candy, and your cake. So even kiddos are aware of this connection. But time and time again, consumption and public opinion shape decorative and fine arts. So tableware is not only functional, it can communicate and represent status, civility, and your own personal style, but they can also outwardly communicate your moral or political viewpoint. So anti-slavery sugar bowls arise, and they're produced mostly throughout the UK, but some are then sold in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. These are two fabulous examples. One says the produce of free labor, and the other says East India sugar not made by slaves. Once again, drawing a line between consumers and human bondage. And these would have provided a talking point during meals or tea time for you and your guests. And I always like to think that if these pieces of tableware are condemning the transatlantic slave trade, they insinuate that others are condoning it. So it's in this world that Martha Washington's sugar bowl steps onto the scene. I want to be clear that Martha Washington does not purchase this set of china for herself, of which the sugar bowl is a part. Instead, it's gifted her. So the set of china is at the very top here, and then underneath is the man who does the gift giving, Andreas van Bram Houtgeest, who is a Dutch East India Company merchant. And he gifts this to Martha Washington in 1796. He actually served in China for many years and then later moved to the United States. And when he moved to the USA, he brought many Chinese decorative and fine arts with him that he had acquired in Canton. And this includes on his ship ledger, a box of china for Lady Washington that we now know to be this set. During the 18th century, affluent Americans would have displayed their wealth by acquiring these luxury goods from abroad, and Chinese porcelain tableware was something more akin to art and a luxury than an actual piece of useful china. Average Americans would have purchased something more affordable and more durable, like pewter, stoneware, earthenware, etc. Van Bram gifts this highly decorative set to Mrs. Washington because he was a great admirer of George Washington, despite the fact that he had no connections to the United States before moving there in the 1790s. In fact, we have this quote during the Revolution where he says he's entirely devoted to the Americans and to their cause, that he learns of their advantages with joy as if all that were my good fortune. And may the Supreme Lord give grace to General Washington so that America may achieve her liberty in spite of her enemies. He goes on to say, I drink sometimes to the health of your brave general, and my heart forms 1,000 wishes for his well-being and for the prosperity of his armies. So we have a little bit of a George Washington fan here. It's no surprise then that he sees Martha, of course, as an extension of George Washington and gifts her this set of china. So I'll give you a moment while I drink this water to take a look at the design. This we know is designed by Mr. Van Bram himself. And many historians refer to this set of china as the US china or the state service because of the states around the rim. But this entire service, including the sugar bowl, is loaded with imagery, and every piece features in the center the monogram MW for Martha Washington. So we know without a doubt this was produced for the explicit purpose of giving it to Martha Washington. There are several other pieces here that indicate the idea of a new victorious American nation after the Revolution. So Martha's initials are on top of a rising sun and placed inside a laurel wreath to show that sort of victory. Beneath, there's a Latin phrase that reads, our union is our glory and our defense against him, which him is supposed to be English King George. And every piece features the names of the 15 states at the time of the set's creation. They're interlinked with a chain to show national unity. And then finally, around the very tippy top, you can see an Ouroboros, a serpent eating its own tail. So all of these showing rebirth, unity of this American patriotism after the revolution. And patriotic motifs are very common in this era in tableware as a testament to their owner's own national pride. But this set is so interesting because this is a foreigner's perspective of what they think Americans care about. And not only what Americans care about, but what Martha Washington would want to communicate to anybody who's dining with her. So even though Martha Washington isn't the one designing this, she accepts the bowl and she preserves it. So it shows that she clearly likes it and seems to agree with the symbolism that Van Bram put on each of these pieces. So now that we've talked about the production and the consumer culture that surrounds this piece, as well as the design, I want to talk more about the use of the sugar bowl and the other pieces in this China service. So the Washingtons got this when they were living at their Philadelphia house, the president's house before the White House was constructed. And they likely used it there and displayed it with other fine tableware in public spaces as a way to once again communicate their wealth, their worldliness, and their patriotism to the many important guests who are dining at their home. The presidential household in Philadelphia, as well as previously in New York, relied on the Washingtons' enslaved laborers that were brought from Mount Vernon up to Philadelphia, separated from their family and their friends, and forced to work in roles like cook, maid, butler, footman, etc. Enslaved servants would have handled this tableware before and after each meal. They likely would have handled it more than any of the owners or guests dining there. And historians Hannah Bocher and Ron Fuchs, who wrote a great article about this China service, write that the wear and tear shown on many of the existing pieces today denote their frequent use by the Washingtons. These enslaved workers at the Washingtons' household also made it possible for the president and first lady to entertain influential individuals at dinners, teas, and receptions that would have included sweetened food using sugar like ice cream, coffee, tea, and cakes. And all of these delicious meals would have been prepared and served by enslaved workers. In particular, I want to highlight the Washingtons' cook, Hercules, in Philadelphia, who would have had a hand in using the sugar that they're eating at their table. And Hercules actually self-emancipated only a year after Martha Washington is gifted this sugar bowl. According to historian and my former colleague, Lindsay Travinsky, Hercules actually earned money from selling scraps from the kitchen at the president's house to Philadelphians, and he may have used this income to aid with his escape. And this is a happy ending because Hercules lived as a free man in New York for the rest of his life. I also just wanted to point out, I know it's difficult to see for those of you in the back or maybe tuning in virtually, but there's this interesting portrait of the Washington family made by the artist Edward Savage. It's in the National Gallery of Art if you want to head over and see it after today's talks. But it actually features an enslaved servant in the background. One of the most interesting depictions of George Washington, and it's actually not the only depiction of Washington that includes an enslaved man. This could be Billy Lee or Christopher Shields, both of whom were very important body servants to Washington throughout his life. But I think it's such a great example of the intertwined life of the Washingtons and their enslaved servants. So this connection between the sugar bowl and slavery goes beyond the Atlantic world right into their own household. Washingtons can't live forever. So in 1802, Martha Washington writes into her will that she is giving and bequeathing to her grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, the set of china by Mr. Van Bram, every piece having MW on it. And lucky for us as historians, they talk about this china by always calling it the one with the MW on it. So we can trace it pretty well throughout history. George Washington Parke Custis, their grandson, takes the sugar bowl as well as the rest of the pieces and displays them at his house, Arlington House. I'm sure many of you are familiar, just across the river from Washington, D.C. And this is when I think the sugar bowl's life gets more interesting. He creates a mini museum there about his step-grandfather's life, displaying not only pieces of this china service, but also things like Washington's Revolutionary War tent, the bed that he died in at Mount Vernon, and other interesting items, creating this memorial museum, etc. After his death in 1857, Custis wills the mansion and the relics that are inside to his daughter, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee, and her husband, Robert E. Lee. So we discussed commodities and consumer culture surrounding sugar and tableware, but this portion of the Sugar Bowl's life is where it experiences a new type of commodification, and that's that of George and Martha Washington's legacy and their memory. So rather than remaining a utilitarian piece, this piece becomes a relic. Historian Teresa Barnett writes a great book, Sacred Relics, Pieces of the Past in 19th Century America. And she talks about the way that Victorian sentimentality in this period really lends itself to a process of turning everyday items into relics. And that items like locks of hair or jewelry or a sugar bowl allowed present day people to connect with people of the past. Now, George Washington is one of the most fascinating examples of this because at the outbreak of the Civil War, we see both the Confederacy and the Union attempt to claim George Washington's memory and lend legitimacy to their cause by literally owning his objects and things that belong to him or to Martha. The South believes that Washington is a Virginian slave owner, a farmer, so he's on our side. And the North says, no, he's on our side. He cared about preserving the Union at all costs. He built this country. Why would he ever fight against us? And so the bowl is sort of tossed between the two as an idea of owning Washington's memory. As a result, the Union Army confiscates the Lee estate in 1861. It's a very important geographic location overlooking the capital city. And when the Union Army goes to confiscate the estate, Selina Gray, an enslaved woman owned by the Lee family, tells them, hey, there are really important George Washington relics inside. She had actually been the caretaker of these objects as the Lees had fled Arlington House when the Civil War started. And she alerts General Irvin McDowell, who's a Union general, that the pieces are there. And he makes an inventory that lists that the Martha Washington china includes one broken plate and one sugar bowl. A battle for ownership ensues over the next few decades, with each side believing themselves the rightful caretakers of the pieces of George Washington's legacy. So that year, 1861, the National Republican, a local newspaper, reports that the pieces of a tea set with the monogram MW had been confiscated and placed on view for visitors at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C. That's the National Portrait Gallery today. And they were there for anybody who wanted to see them. Of course, this is Union territory. After the Civil War ends, Mary Lee requests the return of the objects. The fighting is over. Give us back George Washington's stuff. And President Andrew Johnson says, okay, sure. But then the press gets a hold of the story and people are not happy. It actually leads to a congressional investigation of what to do, not only with the relics, but with the Lee estate. And Northerners are soundly voting to keep the articles in the possession of the federal government, while Southerners are soundly voting to return them to the Lee family. I love this quote that says that these relics are the property of the father of this country, and as such are the property of the whole people, and should not be committed to the custody of any one person, much less a rebel like General Lee. So you really still see this push and pull between North and South and Washington's Sugar Bowl, despite the end of the Civil War. Mary Lee dies in 1873. She still hasn't gotten her stuff back, and her children decide to continue these efforts. And it takes several decades of petitions and lawsuits and referrals to different presidents until in 1901, President William McKinley decides to officially return these relics to the Lee heirs. And at that time, they had actually been on display at the Smithsonian National Museum, right on the National Mall. And you can see them right in the top corner. This is in their exhibit at the, I believe today it's the Arts and Industries building. And you can see the Sugar Bowl on the far side. So easy to track them. But it's interesting because at the very same time that Mary Lee is in these final efforts to get her china back from the federal government, we also see a change in the way that first families and the American people feel about preserving presidential china. For all of White House history, presidents bring and use china at the White House, but most times when a new first family moves in, they either sell or trash the old pieces that are left over. These are not pieces that are considered worthy of historic preservation. But all of that changes in 1889 when First Lady Caroline Harrison decides that we should preserve these items. I should say Caroline Harrison is a preservationist and an artist. She is also the first President General of the DAR, so great connection here today. And she decided to make an inventory of the collection, as well as to make cabinets for the china collection. Unfortunately, though, she dies before these cabinets are made. But somebody else takes up the mantle. Recognizing the lack of attention that had been given to the china for many years, Colonel Theodore Bingham, who is the officer in charge of public buildings and grounds, hired historian Abby Gunn Baker, who you see on screen, to study and publish an article about the collection, hoping that if people heard about these fantastic pieces, they might care about preserving and donating some. She publishes an article in Munsey's magazine in 1903, and subsequently, First Lady Edith Roosevelt decides to make these cabinets that had been Caroline Harrison's vision to display the pieces on the ground floor of the White House. And she and Baker worked diligently to acquire pieces from as many presidential administrations as they could. This photograph shows the China Room in 1918 during Woodrow Wilson's time at the White House. This is when First Lady Edith Bowling-Galt Wilson decides to display those China cabinets in a dedicated room. That's the White House China Room today, ever since it has had all of these pieces of China so that people coming to visit the White House can see them in a museum-like atmosphere. And they're displayed chronologically now. So chronologically first, you may be able to guess it, we get Martha Washington's china. After she secures ownership of the Washington relics in 1901, Mary Custis Lee does something very similar to George Washington Parke Custis. She embarks on a legacy building journey. She decides to distribute a lot of these relics that she finally got a hold of to important historic sites, aware of their role in maintaining the legacy of the Washingtons for future generations. So she gives some to the Smithsonian, she gives some to Mount Vernon, some go to Arlington House, some go to Tudor Place, and some go to the White House. So she heard of Abby Gunn Baker's efforts and knew, even though George Washington never lived at the White House, that they were still interested in having some of his china pieces. In 1915, she donates a Society of the Cincinnati plate, which is actually the first one on the very top left-hand corner. But then 2 years later, she decides to give 2 pieces of the MW service, including the sugar bowl, that are now displayed in the China Room ever since. So you can see it circled there. Unfortunately, when you go to the White House, there's a rope up and you can't walk into the China Room. So if you ever go on a tour of the White House, you have to really crane your neck to see them, but I promise it's in there. So it's been in the White House now for many, many years, over a century. And with this, we've seen that this single piece of tableware can tell us about consumer culture, about national memory, about slavery in the Atlantic world and the United States, and more. As I always like to say, and as so many of you here know, objects aren't passive witnesses to history, they're active ones that shape and reflect the economic, political, and cultural status of their owners. They embody ideas about race, class, and identity, and that studying the economic ecosystem of this object, the cultural background, or the provenance, you quickly realize that the bowl is so much more than just sugar. So to bring this to the present day, I'm currently researching and compiling materials to create a digital exhibit for the association about material culture and slavery at the White House, which will explore the enslaved artisans who toiled to create furniture that's in the White House collection, slave-owning artists that are in the collection, like Clark Mills and Charles Wilson Peale, as well as the legacies of slavery that are visible in the works of African-American artists like Henry Asawa Tanner. So stay tuned for that. It's launching in early 2023. And now I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Is there any documentation about why the decision was made? I know at the time it was like a pseudo museum, but it was ultimately to Barracks Hospital.
It was just a big public space, from my understanding, that they felt like they could. I mean, there's a lot of objects at this point, and they're large objects as well. Did you want to tune in on that?
I'll point to some of my research has to do with fireproof building construction in the 19th century. And I'm not 100% sure, but I made a note to myself to look that up.
Oh, interesting.
I think that was most of the fireproof buildings, for one, are not actually, anyone now would tell you there is no fireproof building, there are fire-resistant buildings. But at the time, most of those buildings were large federal projects because they were the only people who could afford a more expensive construction method, basically. And I think that the patent office,
interesting,
because they intended for that to house a lot of.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. There you go. So I'm sure that plays into it too. Yeah.
I think that's
Like a morale stand. I was here to research at the Frick Gallery. So I was just thinking about about the idea of it being used in the hospital and some of the quotes that are used
Yeah.
about soldiers annotated while housed there.
Definitely. And I mean, there's lots of documentation of just everyday people walking in off the street to see it as well. So there's a lot of push and pull here once again of people are excited to go see it because they really do feel a visceral connection to Washington through it. And so morale is such a big part of that. Oh, yes. So the question was, why was the patent office chosen? Like, what about that building made it a good place to hold the artifacts? And we were talking about maybe it's because it's fireproof. Maybe it's because it's a great public space. Maybe it's because there are soldiers in and out that can boost morale. So lots of factors there. Yes.
If you have this, I found it really curious that that Congress insisted that because George Washington was a public figure, that he belonged to all of us, and so he was stuck. This is post-war, so it's very much, the vibes in it, But I'm wondering what the public reaction to that was, or more public reaction to that controversy, because that's a hot take.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it's interesting in this period too, because this is the same time that we start to see Mount Vernon turning into a museum and the opening of a lot of these other museums in Washington, D.C. Interestingly, I think probably because Washington, D.C. really was erring on the side of the Union still, that the local newspapers are very much on the side of, yes, this is our property, but not so much ours as this is the federal government's property, because the other option that we have is to give it to the Lees. I don't know if the conversation would be the same if it was, this is for all of us, or it's for Mount Vernon, or it's for a different museum, rather than the federal government versus one single rebel. But it's definitely an interesting conversation. I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that into the question. The question was, what was the public response to this congressional investigation and the push and pull of these objects belong to everybody versus should they go back to the Lees?
It is also one of the curious contrast for maple sugar. He said that a lot of people said sugar was bad for your health. He said that can't possibly be true. And I just point that out.
Yeah, it's very important that health does not play into most of these debates. Instead, it's really about the labor. Plus, I know they tried to use beet sugar as another alternative. That one didn't seem to take off as well. And the maple sugar really didn't take off. At Monticello, the trees simply didn't grow well. So it didn't work out in his favor, but the conversations were had. Any other questions? All right.
All right.